Thank you for having me so early in the morning. I'm going to talk to you about the history of conservative foreign policy. It's something I know something about. It's one of the few subjects I know something about. And I've been trying to think of what the title should be, and there's a did Chairman Mao do the "Where do correct ideas come from"? I think it is Mao. Well, my theme is "Where do incorrect ideas come from?" You might think that there has always been a conservative movement in American politics, but in fact there was none until the 1950s. It simply didn't exist. And what Americans came to call conservatism was very different from what the British conservatism was, or what French conservatism was, for instance. Conservative foreign policy in the 1950s was largely developed by two groups. Catholic conservatives, William F. Buckley in particular, and his brother-in-law Brent Bozell, who ghosted Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, and former communists and Trotskyists, particularly Frank Meyer, Whittaker Chambers, and James Burnham. And there were two key ideas of this first stage of conservative foreign policy. The first was that we were engaged in a struggle of good against evil, a kind of Armageddon. It particularly came from the Catholic conservatism, but you can also find it very clearly in Whittaker Chambers' autobiography, Witness. The second idea was that in engaging in this struggle of good against evil, there could be no compromise. That what we saw was not containment, but liberation or rollback. Liberation and rollback were the two key terms of the conservative foreign policy. And in this sense, it was a radical or revolutionary foreign policy, and very much a product, again, of people like Burnham, who had originally been founders of the American Trotskyist movement. Now, that stage of conservatism, conservative foreign policy, really hits the rocks in 1964 when Barry Goldwater fails to get elected. And you have a new phase that begins in the 70s with the rise of what's called neoconservatism. The neoconservatives are, again, largely former socialists, former liberals, people who became primarily disillusioned by the democratic foreign policy, to some extent Kissinger's détente, and to some extent also, we're not going to get into that here, affirmative action and black nationalism. Primarily but not exclusively Jewish, primarily but not exclusively East Coast. And their ideas consist, again, you could put it in terms of two main points. The first is a reaffirmation of the idea of rollback versus containment, but this time framed in terms of a rejection of Kissinger's idea of détente and of any arms treaty, SALT I, SALT II, with the Soviet Union, and the idea that the United States couldn't simply wait but had to aggressively seek victory in the Cold War. The second idea was a rejection of liberal human rights policy, and of the idea that America's responsibility was not just to to defeat communism, but to create a kind of global democracy. And this might seem odd, but the first stage of neoconservatives were realists in this sense, and the key work was Jeane Kirkpatrick's Dictatorships and Double Standards, where she talked about how America had to learn to tolerate people like the generals in Argentina or Pinochet because they were bulwarks against communism, and that those countries anyway would sooner become democracies than the communist countries. So they were realists in that sense, and very different from the first stage of conservatism. Now, that kind of foreign policy very much characterizes the first term of the Reagan administration. It becomes obsolete, obviously, with the end of the Cold War and with Gorbachev, and many of these people did not understand what was happening at the time. But to our whole benefit, Ronald Reagan and George Shultz did. And that transformed American foreign policy. That leads to a third and final stage of conservative foreign policy, what's now called neoconservatism. Based largely in the Weekly Standard, very important magazine that starts, I think, in 1995. Many of the people are the sons or the proteges of the people who were leaders of the first stage: Irving Kristol, Bill Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, John Podhoretz. A lot of them were pupils of famous neoconservatives. Bob Kagan's dad was one of the founders of neoconservatism, and so on. So it's a kind of generational movement in that sense. Its prime ideas, again, let me, instead of doing trinities, duo binary two. First is the Soviet Union is no longer the enemy, but the enemy is more diffuse. It's rogue states. China, which is still seen as, again, as a communist. Islamic militants. Again, this kind of array of people who have designs upon American power and American hegemony. And the objective of this second stage of neoconservatism is not just to roll back these adversaries. John McCain, one of his phrases in 1999 that a neoconservative wrote for him was rogue state rollback, and I think that pretty much sums up the whole politics. But the idea was not just to roll back, but again, to create a global democracy. So you go back to in that sense the ideas of liberal democracy, but you don't do it through international institutions. You do it unilaterally through the assertion of American power. So there is this idea, a transformative idea. The second stage of neoconservatism is radical or revolutionary in the same sense as the first stage of conservatism was, and in distinction to the early neoconservatism, who had this strong trace of realism, and many of them, like Jeane Kirkpatrick, would end up opposing the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and being skeptical about the assertion of American foreign policy in the 90s and the early 21st century. Now, why the change from neocon 1 to neocon 2? There are two explanations outside of the fact that the enemy changes with the end of the Soviet Union. The first is something that I picked up from a British journalist, Dennis Brogan, who talked about America's illusion of omnipotence, and that occasionally in our history we suffer from these illusions. And I think that that's very characteristic of the kind of neoconservative mind of the 90s in the face of, one, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the success of Reagan in the Philippines, again, where we got rid of a dictator and we created a kind of democracy there. The Gulf War again, the Balkans, and then, of course, Afghanistan in November, December of 2001, which seemed to show that American power, even without sending a lot of American troops, could accomplish miracles. So there was this sense that the second generation of neoconservatives had that the first didn't have, that we could do anything, and we could do it ourselves. The second thing is more psychological and generational, and it's something that I discovered when I was writing a biography of William F. Buckley, whose father was an oil man, but who used to read G.K. Chesterton on the train when he'd go from Connecticut to Mexico, and who always dreamed of being a writer. And this was also true, incidentally, of my own father, who was a dress salesman who used to take a typewriter along. And the idea is that children and students often take from their fathers not so much what they ended up doing, but what they wanted to do or what they did when they were younger. So that a second generation replicates not strictly the first generation, but what the first generation thought about when they were younger, or what they might have wanted to do. So the second generation becomes revolutionary and adopts many of the ideas of not just of their, not so much of their parents, but of their parents as young men and women when they were Trotskyists, socialists, communists, or whatever. And so that this second stage of neoconservatism very much is a kind of recapitulation of right-wing, you could put this way, of right-wing Trotskyism, of the attempt to create a kind of new American-dominated capitalist international. That's, again, similar to the first stage. So what can we say, finally, of this progression, which obviously leads, again, to Iraq? The first stage of conservatism reaches its end in 1964, the second in the first term. But the third, this neoconservatism has the unusual fate of having been tried. After September 11th, the neoconservatives provide to a great extent the guiding ideology for the Bush administration in confronting the war on terror and waging the war on terror. And its ideology becomes the underlying idea of the war on Iraq, which is a transformative war, a war that, whatever its other purposes, is meant to transform the Middle East and to change forever the kind of power dynamics there, and to replace what is a kind of shattered and chaotic and difficult system with an American-dominated regional system. So this is an idea that, unlike the others, has actually been tried, and what's happened, it's failed abysmally. I think the question that we have to ask is, will Americans learn from this experience? And I would say that there is a good chance that we will. I think that there's like a 50-year or 60-year divide between when ideas fail and when we just forget it and try them again. Laissez-faire individualism, 1932. Well, it took until the 1980s for people to start thinking about really undoing the New Deal. Invasion of the Philippines, attempt to transform a Asian country. It took us, again, about 50, 60 years to try that again in Southeast Asia and Vietnam. So I'm hoping that this will mark the end of neoconservatism for the next 5 decades. And if it doesn't, we're all in trouble.